My name is Zehra Jumabhoy, and I'm an art historian who lectures at the University of Bristol. And part of what I'm doing at Glynn Vivian is being involved in the way in which we sort of reinterpret the permanent collection and re-establish the linkages with larger questions of empire, Swansea and the world, but also sort of look at the sort of long view of British art history, which of course Welsh art also contributes to. So this exhibition came about as part of the exhibition team at Glynn Vivian and my attempt to look through the permanent collections that the museum has, as well as the archives, that would help us create a perspective on industrial Wales. And something that the archivist Ellie Dawkins and I noticed very strongly when we went through ideas of Welsh landscape and what usually gets forefronted in museum collections is the notion of a Welsh Arcadia, of Wales being this sort of wild, untamed, sublime land with the sort of the great names of Welsh art history being Richard Wilson. There's an acknowledgement that Turner came here and did some amazing scenes, but the narrative is very, very much focused on North Wales and also focused on this kind of idea of an rugged pre-industrial landscape. And something that I was very keen to kind of reverse was this notion of a Welsh la-la land that, really wasn't acknowledging the fact that South Wales in particular, but also North Wales, has an entire history of British industrialization that really contributed not just to Britain's involvement in empire, but also to the very development of the Industrial Revolution within Britain, and how these conversations actually can be made to meet on the walls of a museum like Glynn Vivian, just if we look at our own permanent collection. So, as you see on this wall, we've sort of revisited the same kind of territory that a very famous Welsh artist, Cuffin Williams, was looking at. But while Cuffin Williams is always sort of celebrated for this deep notion of Welshness and the Welsh landscape, stretching back from time immemorial, Peter Pendergrast goes to exactly the same regions, but he foregrounds the fact that these landscapes, these North Walian landscapes in this case, actually are also slate quarries. And so the colours of these landscapes that you see in these paintings foreground the grey of the slate quarries. And you suddenly have to rethink the dialogues that we've usually been given about Wales being this sort of the backward part of Britain, and reverse that to say that there was a point at which industrial Wales was absolutely seminal to British identity from the Industrial Revolution on. This exhibition is relevant today, partly because, as I said, it's a redrawing of Welsh art history, looking at the industrial past of South Wales in particular, but also Wales more generally. But one of the things that is very important to acknowledge is that this industrial history of Wales has come to an end in lots of ways. But I think this particular painting by Jack Crabtree is especially important for that. So it's called Save This Pit. And if one part of the exhibition actually traces the sort of growth of industrial Wales, the sort of the way in which Swansea links with the larger world through empire, through the production of coal, it's also true that by the 80s and even by the 70s, but especially by the 80s, you have that the mines being shut down, and you have the closure of industries and factories. So this one by Jack Crabtree is actually about the sort of demise of industrial Wales. So we see its development, but we also see its ending. This work is by Valerie Gans, one of the women artists in the collection. I'm focusing on this work because it's, in some ways, it's directly related to the major painting that we've got by Josef Herman. So as you can see, it's amazingly sensitive in the way the figures are rendered, particularly this figure here, who looks almost like a sort of Christ-like figure. Possibly he's just a miner fixing the light, which is another thing that we really wanted to focus on in this exhibition, is the idea of going down the mines. So as you can see, this area is rather dark, and it was deliberately painted that way. So we're playing with ideas of light and shadow, but we're also playing with this idea of almost being buried underground to create that experience of a little bit of what the mind is meant to actually be feeling like. So this Valerie Gans work, she is one of the few women allowed, and certainly probably the only woman artist allowed to go underground and to actually sort of talk to the miners while they were working, and create this kind of scene. And as I said, she was even allowed to watch them bathing so she could get the physiognomy correct. And here you really feel like you're going into sort of the deep bowels of the earth, with little shards of light that sort of hit you across the image. And it's a work that really has to be very, very well lit in order to see the different elements of it. So yeah, one of my favorite works, which is actually like a no-brainer because it is the showstopper of the piece, of the show, is Josef Herman's Miners, and it's a really well-known work, which apparently there've been lots of demands to have it back on display because for many people it's one of their favorite artworks in the collection. It's massive, and its full drama can only really be appreciated when you're standing in front of it, and you realize again how cleverly it plays with the idea of light. So you have these huge almost heroic figures of miners, and they seem to glow with this sort of red, ethereal kind of glow from the lamps on their foreheads, but also from the little miners' lamps that they're carrying. And it's such a dramatic work that it's very easy to get totally seduced by them. And one of the reasons that the Glynn Vivian team decided that we should put them in a completely separate section of their own, called Going Down the Mines, in this much darker space, is so that you could get a different narrative when you sort of left their presence. And this is, of course, because if we didn't have this wall here that sort of divided them from us, they would have dominated the entire show. And what we wanted to represent was not just sort of the drama of the mining and the heroic figures of the mining, but also some of the realities behind what that industrial past actually meant for the labourers of Wales. And not all of it, or in fact much of it, was not a heroic, wonderful, community-spirited experience. It was hard work, it was dangerous, there were diseases that were caused, as Isabel Alexander explores. There were sort of mining disasters, which is something that right next door to the Josef Herman we have Nicholas Evans paintings called Coming to the Surface, which show miners in cages almost as they're going up and down the mines. And so we wanted to sort of temper the narrative of Josef Herman, which is a stunning work, with some of the realities, the grittiness of what this past actually meant, and the fact that that grittiness is actually reflected in Welsh art history if you're looking close enough. Okay, so this is actually one of the favorites in the show that people seem to gravitate to as much as they do to the Josef Herman. And sometimes, ironically, I've noticed people coming to this even before they go to the Josef Herman. And it's a work called Politics Eclipsed by Economics. And it's on a wall where the Glynn Vivian team and I were really keen, again, to foreground the fact that this is not a show that is about a romantic, is not about a romantic industrialized past that we totally mourn the passing of. It's a show that is also about the kind of collateral damage, as one of the Glynn Vivian teams said, that was caused by the mines, that was caused by the industry of this region. But at the same time, it's also an artwork that reflects the demise of industrial Wales, particularly, post the 80s with Thatcherism and the shutting down of the mines, which did more or less kill an entire way of being. So while we're aware that the realities were incredibly gritty, if you were a miner, if you were an industrial worker, it's also true that so much of the identity of the South Wales valleys have been completely destroyed as that industry has just gone away, literally leaving the landscape derelict. And scenes where you might have had a bustling market town, you suddenly have nothing because people have left. So I thought this work was a really, really good work, in some ways, to almost end the show on, because you are taken full cycle to going down the mines, seeing the fading away of an agricultural Wales for an industrial Wales, and then the sort of demise of industry that takes us to a landscape that is, in some ways, very derelict. And here you have a sort of circuitry board, which, if you look from a distance, actually looks like an aerial view of Swansea, and it goes very nicely with the kind of aerial views that we've got from the archives. But if you come close, what you see is that that there are sort of wires that actually don't work, that have been pulled up. And it's actually the wiring that sketches the words politics eclipse by economics. And we thought, particularly these days, and particularly with the dialogues coming back about, how do we speak about Thatcherism? How do we speak about the fact that, England has a Tory government in power. Wales still has sort of a Labour government that's very prominent. Whose narratives are going to be foregrounded? How do we look at the history of Britain per se? Who's Britain? Where does Wales fit into the larger dialogue about Britishness? And in many ways, to me, this work sort of encapsulates that whole conversation without varnishing it and making it pretty. So we're now ending where we began the discussion, which was Swansea and the world. And so this is actually quite an interesting work, because if you look closely at it, you see these little flags. And one of the flags here is the British East India Company flag. And of course, for some people, it reminds them of the American flag. And that, of course, is because the American flag itself was a kind of blueprint of the East India Company flag, which you can see here. So this again foregrounds the connection between Swansea and the valleys and South Wales, and a larger input into empire. Now, this is something that, at Glynn Vivian is very, very and increasingly acknowledged, because of course the Glynn Vivian money that went to set up this museum also came from copper. And so Swansea's connection through its industrial history with colonialism is something that is very, very much ripe for re-exploration. Both the sort of a kind of celebration in some sense of a larger Welsh involvement within empire, but I say celebration very much in inverted commas, as well as an acknowledgement of guilt. So there's a narrative going around at the moment, which is very prominent in a Welsh political landscape, that Wales is also should be looked at as a colony of England. And while I agree that there are similarities with Wales, with somewhere like India, for instance, these are both in very seminal ways also post-colonial landscapes, I think there's another side of the dialogue that we do in Wales have to acknowledge, is that that Wales was part of a larger Britain, and so there's also a question of culpability. And at Glynn Vivian, no one is trying to cover that over. We're very, very sort of keen to explore the connects that sort of between, say, Wales and India. So specifically, this project is going to lead on to a series of conversations, panels, seminars, mostly online, with the Science Museum in Bengaluru, where we're looking at art and industry in the way in which there are colonial connections, but also the way in which there are contemporary connections between India and Wales. And as I said, it's a twofold dialogue. At one level, we're looking at the similarities, but at another level, we're also acknowledging that there was a power dynamic and there are differences. Perhaps the last thing to end on is a little bit of irony, which is that, if you could say that Wales's involvement in empire through the copper, through the coal, shipped out of Swansea ports, is something that, we have to sort of acknowledge a kind of guilt for, you can also now, see how the tables have turned. For instance, Port Talbot Steelworks are owned by an Indian company called Tata Steel. So perhaps that's some kind of like coming full cycle.